We're beginning Chapter 2, The Nature of Secret Team Activity, a Cuban Case Study. Of the secret team, the CIA and its allies in control of the United States and the world by retired Colonel Fletcher Prouty. Probably dead now. Most definitely. The call was from Miami, and it was placed to a covert CIA phone drop in Washington. It came from a Cuban underground contact point on the campus of the University of Miami. The control point there had just received a call from an undetermined location in Mexico. The call had been made by the pilot of a Cuban crew that had been lost and had made a forced landing. The crew was safe and the plane was intact, but in Mexico. An old C-54, a former U.S. Air Force 4-engine transport, had taken off the night before from the secret Cuban training base at Retalhuleu in Guatemala. It was flown by a Cuban crew and their target had been a drop zone in the Sierra Madre Mountains. Sierra Madre Mountains of Cuba. Everything had gone wrong. The drop zone had been cleared and approved by Washington just a few hours before takeoff, yet it had been hostile. Either intelligence had been bad or the Cuban ground reception party had been captured. The signals from the ground had been right, luring them in with confidence. But as soon as they began the drop, the whole mountainside had erupted with small arms fire. They had been ambushed, and they had been lucky to get down safely over the waves and back across the Caribbean. Hours later, somewhere over Central America, in pre-dawn darkness, had circled over a heavy layer of clouds, watching their gas gauges, waiting for the sunrise and hoping for a break in the clouds so they could let down, fearful of the mountains and with their radio navigation equipment unreliable. They dared not let down until they had clear contact with the ground. At that point, they cared little for all the precautionary instructions of the agency mission commander that had been given them during their briefing before they took off. All they wanted to do was to find a safe place to land. They knew the plane was stateless, that it was unmarked and had no insignia. It did not even have a legal call sign. In fact, the big transport was very special. Although it looked like any other C-54 or DC-4, a trained observer would have noticed those things, and that it had unusual radios, no engine decals, and no manufacturer's labels. It was a clean and non-attributable plane. It had been sanitized and was the pride of the clandestine operator's art. It could have been flown anywhere in the world, and if it had been lost on some clandestine mission, the finder, whether was Cuban, Congolese, or Russian, might have assumed that it had been operated by Americans, but he would not have been able to prove it. In other words, the U.S. government, if required, could have plausibly disclaimed ownership of the plane, and that it had anything to do with the plane, its crew, and its cargo. The plane had been on many flights along the Iron Curtain borders, on leaflet drops, and on electronic intelligence missions. It had been used for paradrop missions in Greece and in Jordan. It had been to the Congo and had delivered black cargoes. Here's the footnote for this. In special operations, black flights deliver black cargo into denied or unwitting areas. Black, in this sense, is usually synonymous with clandestine. A black cargo would not go through customs, USA or foreign. A black cargo might be a defector from the communist world being flown to a safe house in the USA or other host country. If the black flight crossed the ocean, it would be known as a deep-water flight. Clandestine shipments are made by all modes of transportation, including submarines and PT boats. Now, where were we? Okay, here we go. It had been used for paradrop missions in Greece and in Jordan. It had been used in the Congo to deliver the black cargoes to the Katangese, even while other U.S. Air Force C-130 aircraft were flying Congolese troops and supplies against the rebels. It had been to Clark Field near Manila, flying Tibetans to and from operational training sites. It had often been to the old World War II B-29 Superfortress bomber bases in Saipan, where Southeast Asians were being trained in sabotage attacks and paramilitary civic action programs. But on this flight, its crew had been Cuban. A former Cuban airline pilot was at the controls, and one of his old co-pilots was with him. The navigator had at one time trained with the Cuban Air Force, and the radio man, also a Cuban, had been trained at a U.S. Air Force school undercover as a member of a Nicaraguan training mission. The crewmen were all natives of Cuba, and all were working with the CIA at that secret base that had been cut out of the open country of western Guatemala. In keeping with clandestine operational procedures, the crew had been frisked before they got on the plane and had been given sanitized uniforms for the trip so that they would have no identification with them in the event they fell into enemy hands. In this case, a somewhat meaningless precaution, but routine anyhow. However, in typical old-school pilot fashion, the pilot had written certain radio frequency numbers on his wrist with a ballpoint pen, and some of those numbers were a code for the telephone number of the contact office in Miami. Later that morning, after sunrise, they had flown further to the north, seeking a clearing in the clouds through which they could descend. As soon as they found one, they let down into a broad valley and found a small, marked airfield. They landed and skidded across the field into a nearby farm. The first thing they did was to look for a telephone. While they were placing that call, the airport manager and his apprentice came out to see what had happened. After a few moments of eavesdropping, the manager had all the information he needed. The old Mexican drew a gun, and the crew was captured somewhere in Mexico. They were not heard from again until after their Cuban friends had attacked the beach at the Bay of Pigs, had been imprisoned by Castro, and ransomed by the United States. It was only after all these events had the Mexicans released the crew and permitted them to return to Florida. However, their phone call had started some frantic work in Miami and in Washington. The weather map had shown that the heavy cloud cover over Central America gave way to broken clouds further north in Mexico. The CIA called the Pentagon and asked for assistance, and a call was made to the air attaché in Mexico City. He inquired among his Mexican friends about a transport plane, but learned nothing at first. Then, several days later, he heard a rumor that a large transport had been made. Oh, wait a minute. He heard a rumor that a large transport had made a forced landing at a very small southern airfield. He and a CIA man who worked in Mexico City under the cover of a cargo airline made a quick trip to that field. As they approached, they saw the telltale marks of the skidding stop which had been made by the DC-4 in the fresh turf. The plane was gone. When they landed, the airport manager met them. He told them enough to confirm that the plane they were looking for had been there, that the Mexican Air Force had flown it away, and that this Mexican and his apprentice knew all there was to know about the incident. Some time later, the attaché was invited to call upon Mexican Air Force headquarters. He learned that the Mexicans had looked up this plane. Wait a minute. He learned that the Mexicans had looked this plane over carefully and did not want to keep it. However, the Mexicans added that they were sure the Americans would be willing to exchange this special plane for another just like it. Not long after that, the old Black Flight DC-4 was returned to its operational base at Elgin Air Force Base in Florida. The CIA arranged for the Mexican Air Force to retrieve a good-as-new DC-4 from the U.S. Air Force, and far to the south an airport manager, his apprentice, and his son, the husband of the telephone operator who had heard the whole story too, all sported brand new 1961 Ford Thunderbird automobiles from some unknown donor. The true story is not really important, except that it raises certain questions and will shake most Americans. For example, how does one government agency buy a U.S. Air Force transport aircraft, convert it to a civilian aircraft, and then give it as tribute to another country in exchange for one which was lost on a clandestine mission? Or how does a government agency purchase 3 new 1961 Ford Thunderbird automobiles and deliver them to a remote site in Mexico and give them to some Mexicans? Who makes such decisions? Why Thunderbirds? Why pay tribute to Mexico for the airplanes that quite obviously, once it had been identified, belonged to the United States? Its very strangeness made it easier to identify if desired and harder to identify if disclaimed. It would have been stateless only if the United States had disclaimed it. When the United States claimed it, why didn't this government expect the Mexicans to give it back? Who decides such things? And how is it all done in total secrecy? Then to the next level of questions, who in the government believes that once tribute is paid to another country such as Mexico, the problem ends there? Does it not occur to these same officials that Mexicans speak to Guatemalans and Nicaraguans, and even to Vietnamese, and perhaps to Russians, and Chinese as well? Who kids whom? Does the aircraft of a DC-4 close the case and really buy silence, or does it more likely escalate the problem? And then what does all of this behind-the-scenes duplicity do to foreign relations? Doesn't it raise some international eyebrows and make some people wonder who is running the foreign affairs of the United States in the first place? Isn't that exactly what Mr. Khrushchev wanted to know when he challenged Eisenhower either to reveal those who had sent the U-2 over Russia without the president's permission and authorization, or to accept the blame himself, signifying that the United States foreign policy included the authorization of covert operations? If the Mexicans received tribute for one such mistake, would it be surprising to learn that the Indonesians had demanded even more tribute for a bigger mistake? Or when the government leadership shifts back and forth, as has happened several times in Laos? Doesn't anyone stop to think about the tales that are told by those on both sides to their new friends? What are the Indians telling the Russians about us now in 1972 concerning our actions there in 1962? Or what have the Pakistanis been telling the Chinese concerning their participation in the former U-2 operations or in the Tibetan support activities that had been launched from Pakistan? Doesn't all of this make it seem rather insincere and even hypocritical for some Americans to challenge other Americans with security indiscretions when officials in the government have been telling thousands of foreign people, officials and peons, that the United States has been playing the clandestine game to the hilt? How can anyone honestly charge Jack Anderson, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, Daniel Ellsberg, or anyone else with serious violations of security when some of these same sacrosanct individuals who point the finger have themselves approved of such things as the payment of tribute for our clandestine indiscretions and misdeeds all over the world? All of these questionable operations have begun from such small first steps. In the beginning of the Cuban exercise, the CIA had made contact with the Yedgoras family in Guatemala for the use of a large tract of farmland for a training site and an airfield. This site was developed to include a full-sized airport from which heavy transports, bombers, and training planes operated on a very heavy schedule. Although this site was remote, it was certainly not secret. The extent of the activity that took place there was such that it did not take long before there was no secrecy and no possibility for denial that something very special was taking place. The whole world knew that a major clandestine operation was underway and that the United States and Guatemala at least were involved. Who paid Guatemala for all this? And was it paid to individuals, or was it all paid to the Guatemalan government? These questions give clues to some of the characteristics of the CIA and the secret team operations. The secret team members have become so powerful and ambitious that sometimes they no longer respect the basic fundamentals of their profession. As far back as 1948, the CIA had been given limited authority by the National Security Council to carry out only those clandestine operations that the National Security Council directed. This authority is contained in a series of documents, the first of which was issued in the summer of 1948 and was called National Security Council 10-2. October 2nd. National Security Council, October 2nd. When the National Security Council granted this authority, it did so with the firm stipulation that any special operation must be truly clandestine, that it must be performed in such manner that if the exercise failed or was otherwise discovered, the U.S. government would be able to plausibly The U.S. government would be able to plausibly disclaim its role in the operation, and further, what would seem most obvious, but was added for emphasis, that it must be truly secret and concealed. These basic parameters, as established by the National Security Council, have never been officially retracted, although some have been badly abused by oversight. During the Truman and Eisenhower years, clandestine meant clandestine, and the ability to disclaim the operation plausibly meant that too. But as operations became more frequent and increased in size and scope, as they did against Castro in 1960 and 61, the CIA became forgetful of these strictures upon its methods of operations. From time to time, even presidents have permitted a relaxation of their stringent application. The Pentagon Papers reveal how this doctrine had been disregarded, especially with regard to the Plan 34, the so-called covert raids against Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam. By 1961, the CIA had succeeded in building such a broad base within the bureaucracy of the U.S. government that any meaningful reference to the CIA must take into consideration the existence of this vast infrastructure and must not be limited to the legal or table of organization CIA. Most references to the CIA and the secret team in this book are a part of the CIA that is not under the Deputy Director of Intelligence. Here's a footnote here for this. Deputy Director of Intelligence, DDCI, is his deputy below these men, three other deputy directors, DD/I, Deputy Director of Intelligence, responsible for the real and overt intelligence activity of the agency, DDP, Deputy Director of Plans, responsible for the clandestine activity of the agency. By far the largest and most complex portion of the agency is the Special Operations part of the business. Deputy Director of Support, DDS, responsible for the logistics support. This is the most effective part of the agency and makes the others look good. DDA, Deputy Director of Administration, no longer a part of the agency. Note 2, an agency man, Deputy Director of Plans, can be used as an adjective, as in, I'm going to Europe with some of the Deputy Department of Support guys on that new Deputy Director of Plans project. The same applies with divisions, directorates, and sections. The CIA is very loose about these things. For example, you can say something was done by Special Operations without ever having to say that it was a Special Operations Division. There is no Special Operations Division in the agency. Continuing. He is responsible primarily for intelligence production, the Deputy Director of Intelligence that is, and not for covert activity. By 1961, the non-intelligence, the clandestine, and the support sectors of the agency had become so large and so predominant that they far outnumbered the professional band of intelligence specialists assigned to the Deputy Director of Intelligence? Yep. Really gotta reread that. Messing up the flow. By 1961, the non-intelligence, the clandestine, and the support sectors of the agency had become so large, so predominant, that they far outnumbered the professional band of intelligence specialists assigned to the Deputy Director of Intelligence, both at home and abroad. By 1961, it had become apparent that the CIA played a split personality role to suit its own purposes. It would speak of CIA reports which said one thing, then it would be doing exactly the opposite with its undercover covert sections. This too becomes readily apparent to the diligent reader of the Pentagon Papers, lest the tremendous significance of such a change taking place within the U.S. government be insufficiently regarded, considering the words of Arnold Toynbee, the eminent British historian and friend of the United States, as set forth in the New York Times of May 7, 1970. To most Europeans, I guess, America now looks like the most dangerous country in the world. Since America is unquestionably the most powerful country, the transformation of America's image within the last 30 years is frightening for Europeans. It is probably still more frightening for the great majority of the human race who are neither Europeans nor North Americans, but are Latin Americans, Asians, and Africans. They, I imagine, feel even more insecure than we feel. They feel that, at any moment, America may intervene in their international affairs with the same appalling consequences as have followed from American intervention in Southeast Asia. For the whole for the world as a whole, the CIA has now become the boogeyman that communism has been for Americans. Wherever there is trouble, violence, suffering, tragedy, the rest of us are now quick to suspect the CIA had a hand in it. Our phobia about the CIA is, no doubt, as fantastically excessive as America's phobia about world communism. But in this case, too, there is just enough convincing guidance to make the phobia genuine. In fact, the roles of America and Russia have been reversed in the world's eyes. Today, America has become the world's nightmare. Yeah. When an uncontrolled and perhaps uncontrollable team can flaunt the historic and traditional codes of civilization by disregarding the honor and sovereignty of other countries, large and small, by intervening in the internal affairs of other countries for reasons real and contrived, the rest of the world does fear for its own welfare and for the future of this country. When President Eisenhower accepted the responsibility for the U-2 flights over the Soviet Union, no one would have questioned that he did this for correct and honorable reasons. National Aeronautics and Space Administrator, NASA, Keith Glennon, had already made a public statement that the U-2 was operating out of Turkey as a NASA high-altitude flight research aircraft, and had strayed over Russian territory inadvertently in high winds. Then, when Khrushchev produced the wreckage of the U-2 deep in Russia near Sverdlovsk. Damn. It made a mockery of the... Okay, damn. When the Khrushchev produced the wreckage of the U-2 deep in Russia near Sverdlovsk, it made a mockery of the NASA cover story. And when he produced the pilot alive and well, it demolished the rest of the plausible disclaimer. The CIA was caught without a plausible cover story, and the president had to choose. He would either discredit Allen Dulles and the CIA for operating the clandestine flight and a long series of flights without his knowledge, or he could, as Eisenhower did, stand up and take the blame for himself on the basis that he knew of and had ordered the flights and was in complete control of everything done in the foreign arena by this government. The latter choice would mean that the President of the United States is Commander-in-Chief during peacetime clandestine operations as he is in times of war. This is a totally new doctrine born of the vicissitudes of the Cold War. Many have considered this a very noble stand on the part of President Eisenhower, and it was. However, this public admission by the Chief of State that he had directed clandestine operations within another state is exactly the type of thing that reduces the prestige and credibility of the United States in the family of nations to the condition described by Arnold Toynbee. Interference in the internal affairs of one nation by another is an unpardonable violation of international law and custom. The entire Bay of Pigs buildup and operation went much further into flaunting this international code of ethics. At least the YouTube operation on a worldwide scale had been managed in such a manner that the chances of success were great, that the flights were operated in small units with great secrecy, and the stipulation that they be strictly clandestine and plausibly disclaimable in the event of failure was not outwardly flaunted until, perhaps, the Gary Powers flight. But the Cuban program was otherwise. By the time Cuban operations had been expanded to the point they had become the beginning of the Bay of Pigs operation, activity of all kinds had been discovered and compromised by the press of the world. There were no more secrets. The participation and support of the United States was known to be taking place in Puerto Rico, Panama, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, in addition to some unscheduled action in Mexico. Yet the secret team continued to launch an increasing number of special operations without regard for real secrecy. There was not only a breakdown in the traditional ethics of international relations, but there was also a secret degradation of the usual high standard of technical operational methods within the government. The flights from Guatemala themselves were not tactically sound, nor were they politically effective. Most of these flights not only failed miserably to accomplish what the CIA thought they would do, in other words, put in place underground cadres of guerrillas and provide equipment and communications material for other underground groups in Cuba, but a result of their amateurism and failures, they played into the hands of Castro. They never did become a rallying point for anti-Castroites. On the contrary, they exposed and compromised them and led them to many unnecessary firing squad deaths. The flight paths, by their crossing and recrossing, pinpointed and exposed ground reception parties, which were mopped up by Castro's troops. In other cases, aircraft were lured over drop sites that proved to be ambushes. The whole series of operations exposed the weakness of the CIA tactical capacity. The CIA cannot properly direct large operations. It has led many small ones successfully, but has failed miserably in a number of large ones. An important oversight inherent in such activity was mentioned by David Weiss and Thomas B. Ross in their book, The Invisible Government. They reported the chief U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff were told that the investigation was not a Pentagon operation and that they could give advice only when called upon. Because of the secrecy involved, they were not allowed to take their staffs into the confidence. This, of course, cut down on their overall effectiveness. This was only a part of the story. The chiefs were told to keep hands off, yet the agency was operating down through all services to the tactical level, taking supplies, arranging training, utilizing all forms of transportation. However, few, if any, military personnel ever knew enough of what was really going on to give proper advice had they been asked. This is one of the greatest weaknesses of the secret team's classified method of operation. Because the secret team acts in response to intelligence data inputs, it does not operate in compliance with or in support of a plan or policy. It creates an umbrella or catch-all policy such as anti-communism, then declares that all of its operations are anti-communist, and attempts to justify what it does solely on the basis to clarify. By example, a Cuban reported to another Cuban who was in touch with a CIA contact man in Miami that he had friends back in Cuba who were willing to blow up a major sugar refinery, but they had no munitions or other equipment necessary to do this. The CIA Cuban reported this to his contact. A meeting was arranged right away in a safe house, for example, in Latin America, Geological Survey offices somewhere on the campus of the University of Miami. The first Cuban showed on a map where his friends were and explained where they planned to do. The CIA contact man proposed that the first thing to do would be to establish contact with them and then to place a clandestine radio with them to test the zeal and veracity of the informant. It was suggested that this be done by putting him ashore at the night near the target. He agreed, on the assurance that he would be picked up the next night. He was taught how to use the clandestine radio and was provided with a special kit of munitions. He was put over the beach and directed to bring one Cuban out with him for further training. All went well to that point. At no time in this almost automatic response process did anyone in the CIA ask, "Why are we doing this?" The simple Pavlovian animal instinct to go ahead and to do it because it was an anti-Castro move was all the agents needed at this stage of activity. But this is where it always starts. Of course, the secret team members would have right on their side in almost religious missionary zeal to do good. The first agent would not only have heard that the Cubans planned to blow up the sugar refinery, but they would have flavored this with ideas of injustice there and with accounts of brutality of Castro's police. And they would have pledged that the reason they wanted to kill Castro was that they want to bring democracy to their homeland and to all Cuban people. The fun and games must always be founded upon sanctimonious grounds. At the same time, lip service was paid to do gooder causes. There is scarcely ever any practical consideration of whether or not such an action, or those that will follow, whether the initial action succeeds or fails, are really in the best interests of the United States. The exfiltrated Cuban was given rudimentary demolition training as at a remote site in Florida and was taught to use signal lights and panels as well as the radio. Less than a week later, he was back in Cuba at work with his neighbors in the sugar refinery gang. Although everything seemed to have gone well, these inexperienced, though patriotic Cubans had no understanding of the pro-Castro operated communist preferred bloc system that was in effect in Cuba and that blanketed the entire island. Not one in the CIA had warned them about this, if the thought had ever crossed their minds. As soon as the first Cuban had been exfiltrated, his absence was duly noted by the system. He had not appeared for work at the refinery, but not a word was said there. A teacher at school was tipped off to make a discreet inquiry of the man's child. Could your father come to school to see your pretty drawings? Well, no, teacher. You see, my father is not feeling well. He's sick. Then a state medical technician stopped by his home and asked to see the father because it had been reported he is sick. The mother explained that he was not really sick. It was his uncle in Santiago who was sick, and he had gone to see the uncle. So the net was drawn tighter. Even before he had returned to Cuba, a Castro agent had been infiltrated into the refinery work crew, and by the time the Patriot returned, Castro's men were ready. They waited alert. They listened to all the plans. Perhaps they joined in encouraging the plans. Then, on the night of the raid on the refinery, everything went wrong. The whole cabal had been rounded up, and in no more time than it took for a radio operator to flash an emergency signal to Miami, it was all over. The reaction to the first information input by the first CIA agent had doomed those men to death, and their families and friends to lives of misery. Castro's control, rather than being weakened, had been strengthened by the brutal elimination of a few more men of blind courage and the example of that same fate for others who might wish to conspire with the Yankees. In this example, which is a true case, if the attack had been successful, what good would it have done? Do such random bits of vandalism and sabotage actually further the foreign policy goals of the United States? Is this kind of anti-Castroism really pro-American? The very little harm to Castro and his government, if any, that might possibly have been done, could not conceivably generate enough benefit to the United States ever to compensate for the loss this country suffers when such activities fail, and they so often do. This brings to mind the prophetic words from the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. I wonder often what the vintners buy, one half so precious as the stuff they sow. I wonder why the vintners buy one half so precious as the stuff they sow. Nevertheless, the secret team takes even such a gross failure as a challenge. They interpret it as some sort of Castroite dare, and they leap into action again to gamble with other men's lives. In Miami and in Washington, the failures of the first raid was only the beginning. Word was flashed to the CIA that a Castro attack had wiped out an anti-communist underground cell. Instead of leaving the blown operation at that, the CIA readied the next step. No mention was made of how the initial contact was begun, nor of the agent's assisted first attempt, which was the provocation to Castro. Instead, it was made to look as though Castro's attack upon the people was entirely unprovoked except by their anti-communism. As the next level of reaction, the CIA suggested an attack over the beach against that sugar refinery in reprisal for Castro's so-called brutal attack upon the anti-communist Cubans. It would be added as part of the line that one of the reasons for this next attack would be to show the Cuban people that the United States was right behind them. A briefing along these lines was prepared and delivered to the special group of the National Security Council, as much for intragovernmental public relations and flag waving as for the approval of the CIA felt it should get for this covert operation, which was expected to be closely supported by Americans. In this manner, small clandestine operations escalate, even though there may have been no real foreign policy guidelines for such courses of action. The CIA selected a team of Cubans from one of the major training sites in the United States or Central America, and trained and equipped them for the major reprisal raid against the Castro provocation against innocent Cubans. The U.S. Navy was requested to provide offshore assistance limited to action in international waters. The Navy would launch and recover a small, fast boat, which would make the actual landing a date. During the dark phase of the moon was picked, the weather checked, and the small boat with special Cuban team abroad was launched. They were crack demolitions experts, familiar with the Navy SEAL team method of high-speed operation. They made a successful landing and approached the refinery. The block system was already alerted and had been waiting. The sentry dogs picked up the men as they moved ashore, and the whole team was wiped out. Their rafts were found hidden on the beach, and when the sentry boat returned for the pre-planned recovery, the correct light signals, beaten from the team by Castro's experts, lured the fast boat near the beach into an ambush. In the sky above, Castro's planes alerted to the position offshore, observing the waiting U.S. Navy vessel, and confirmed that this action had official U.S. government support. Again, things did not stop there. The challenge was great. Americans had been involved closely in that activity. The urge to outwit and to whip Castro was strong. The next round of attacks was to be even greater effort, until the ultimate invasion of the Bay of Pigs. This type of scenario happened many times and in varying targeted areas, and with new characters and new supporting casts. Some of them were unsuccessful. Some of them were successful to the extent that the teams participating accomplished their assigned tasks, or said they did and returned safely. Others were lost, and this first one was. And in every case, it may be certain that success or failure resulted in massive punitive action against the local population. It wasn't long before all Cubans prayed that they would not be the lucky and fortunate anti-communists selected by the benevolent Americans for the next anti-Castro strike. The CIA's greatest strength derives from its ability to activate various parts of the U.S. government, usually the Defense Department. With minor inputs designed to create reaction, it finds a minor fact, which it interprets to evaluate to be communist-inspired, or inspired by some other favorite enemy, Trujillo or de Gaulle. Then it feeds this item into the White House and to defense, where response reaction takes place predictably and automatically. To carry this to the next level, the CIA, by utilizing its clandestine facilities, can stir up the action it wants to further use, in turn to stir up a reaction response within the U.S. government structure. Although such actions and reactions usually begin on a very small scale, they escalate rapidly, as in Indonesia, Tibet, and Greece. They went completely out of control in Southeast Asia. It is the type of game played by the clandestine operator. He sets the scene by declaring in many ways and over a long period of time that communism is the general enemy, and that the enemy is about to strike or has begun a subversive insurgency campaign in a third country. Then the clandestine operator prepares the stage by launching a very minor and very secret provocative attack of a kind that is bound to bring open reprisal. These secret attacks, which may have been made by third parties or by stateless mercenaries whose materials were supplied secretly by the CIA, will undoubtedly create reaction within turn is observed in the United States. This technique was developed to a high art in the Philippines during the early Magsaysay buildup, to the point where the hooks were actually some of Magsaysay's own troops, disguised and set upon the unwary village in the grand manner of the Cecil B. DeMille production. The next step is to declare the enemy's act one of aggression or subversive insurgency, and then the next part of the game is activated by the CIA. In part of the operation will be briefed to the National Security Council Special Group, and it will include, at some point, American support. So it will go as high and as mighty as the situation and authorities will allow. It is not a new game. It was practiced, albeit amateurishly and uncertainly, in Greece during the late 40s, and it was raised to a high state of art under Walt Rostow and McGeorge Bundy against North Vietnam to set a pattern for the Gulf of Tonkin attacks. In fact, a number of the leading actors in the cast of key characters in the greatest scenario of them all, the war in Vietnam, received their earliest training in the Greek campaign of the 40s. All of the mystery surrounding those actions was unveiled in the Pentagon Papers with the revelation of such things as the covert Plan 34. Operations arising in this manner and from such sources are, unfortunately, frequently the result of the endeavors of the overambitious, the irresponsible, and the ignorant. They are often enmeshed with and enhanced by the concealed drives of the special interest groups like the Marines, who wanted a share of Vietnam in 1964, the general contractor interests who wanted to dig a big hole in the shore and call it Cam Ranh Bay, the Special Forces Green Berets who wanted to resurrect the doughboy, and many others who simply wanted to sell billions of dollars worth of armaments. Such operations are carried out by those who either do not care about the results or who do not see far enough ahead to understand the consequences of what they are doing. This is a delicate subject and needs much understanding. Many innocent and totally loyal men become involved in these activities, but the trouble is that they come upon the scene after the first provocations have been made, and they are generally unaware of them. An allowance must be made for the fact that the provocation can come from either side. Neither side is all right or wrong, but the fact remains that most of the men who become involved in these activities do so after there has already been some clandestine exchange. They are trying to correct what they believe has been a serious abuse. They do not know where the real action began. To put it simply, they don't know whether they came in on the first or second retaliation strike. Very few would ever be party to striking first in any event. So the first strike takes place in deep secrecy. No one knows the hidden key fact. This is a fundamental game of the secret team. They have this power because they control secrecy and secret intelligence, and because they have the ability to take advantage of the most modern communication systems in the world, of global transportation systems, of quantities of weapons of all kinds, of a worldwide U.S. military supporting base structure. They can use the finest intelligence system in the world, and most importantly, they are able to operate under the canopy of an ever-present enemy called communism. And then, to top all of this, there is the fact that the CIA has assumed the right to generate and direct secret operations. When we stop and think what the real struggle is and what we have been doing, we are faced with a stark realization that what has been going on is not anti-communist, nor is it pro-American. It is more truthfully exactly what those wise and wily chess players in the Kremlin have hoped we would do. They have been the beneficiaries of our own defense-oriented, reaction-prompted intelligence-duped Pavlovian self-destruction. How can anyone justify the fact that the United States has lost 55,000 men in Indochina and that the Russians have lost none, and call that anti-communist? Or worse yet, pro-Americans? How can anyone note that we have poured more than $200 billion into Indochina since 1945, and that the Kremlin may have put up somewhere between 3 and 5 billion as their ante to keep the game going, and then call that tragic ratio anti-communist and pro-American? How can anyone believe that after more than 25 years of clandestine and overt engagement in Indochina that finds ourselves wasted and demoralized and precariously degraded in the eyes of much of the world, including our friends, we have accomplished anything that is really anti-communist and pro-American? What do words have to mean, and what do events have to prove to wake us all up to the fact that pro-American actions are those that strengthen this country, and that anti-communist actions are those that weaken communism? It certainly bothers the Kremlin not at all to see Americans dying in Asia, and to see Asians dying at the hands of the Americans. There are tens of thousands of loyal, dedicated, and experienced men in the Department of Defense, both military and civilian, who have the type of experience it takes to make an operation effective. In matters of tactics and logistics, there are few men in the world who know more about the subject than they do. However, the secret team operates behind such a shield of secrecy that they keep facts of what they are doing from these experts as well as from the enemy. As a result, all of these people who could help are left out. The very men who, by their experience and ability, could make these operations succeed, or who have the good sense to say that they have no hope of success, are ignored and excluded from participation at the very time when they are needed the most. Once these minor actions are set in motion on the basis that they are anti-communist, whether they succeed or fail, they escalate under specifically halted by top echelon authority, and then the whole pattern of events is locked in as anti-communist, whether or not this really is so. Furthermore, these very difficult operations are left in the hands of the inexperienced, the irresponsible, and the ignorant. Whenever an operation grows to the extent that the Bay of Pigs project did, the President and at least the National Security Council must insist that the finest men in the country be brought in to assist with the planning, the tactical details, and the essential logistics, and that these men should have the right in veto the project if need be, not just to remain silent, as has happened in the case of men as high as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Such silence, even in the face of the CIA. Here's the footnote. If military chief of staff did disagree so deeply with a plan briefed to him by the CIA that he decided to discuss his views with others, it is more than likely the CIA would charge him with a security violation or withdraw his clearance, or both. The agency would attack him on security grounds, not on substantive grounds or on merits of the case. Such silence, even in the face of the CIA, is inexcusable, even though the men involved in stating their case might be fired, as happened to one of the military chiefs after the Cuban rocket crisis of 1962. Everyone understands that a certain amount of secrecy, used properly and applied with an eye to impact... Everyone understands that a certain amount of secrecy, used properly and applied with an eye to the impact with which the normal erosion of time plays on events, is essential. However, when secrecy becomes a means of existence itself, when operations take place that never should have been permitted had they been fully revealed, when operations take place that grow out of all proportion to the action originally proposed and briefed to higher authority, and when all of this is veiled in unnecessary secrecy applied within the U.S. government and against some of the people whose assigned responsibilities would most qualify them to know what was going on, then this type of secrecy is totally wrong and leads to the ghastly and insidious situation that has been quite honestly and accurately described above by Arnold Toynbee. And lest there be those who brush aside Toynbee as an old meddler, let us recall the wise words of Henry S. Truman when he wrote that the CIA is being interpreted as a symbol of sinister and mysterious foreign intrigue and a subject for Cold War enemy propaganda. When one of our own presidents feels that he must warn that the CIA, which he created, had become a tool of enemy propaganda against the United States, it is time to underscore that things are not as they should be. The very fact that the CIA would not allow the Joint Chiefs of Staff to take their staffs into their confidence regarding the Cuban invasion is one of the deepest problems such an ad hoc type of operation creates. This is a two-edged problem. However, no chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, especially not the very experienced and able Lyman L. Lemnitzer, should ever have permitted such a thing to have happened. If what Wise and Ross wrote is true, and we don't question it, and if it was known to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that he could not use his experienced staff as they have stated it, then it certainly must have been the duty of the chairman to make this known to the Secretary of Defense, Robert S. McNamara, and to President Kennedy. The law gives him that right, and it gives him that duty. The chairman is quite properly in the position to take such matters to the president, and he could at any time have done so. Why didn't he? It would seem to have been an easy solution, but as with other things in this confusing area, it was not simple. For one thing, there was so much he did not know about the total plan. If he knew the whole operation and then did not speak to the president, that would be one thing. But if he knew only fragments of the plan, and if he had been told by his higher authority, namely the Secretary of Defense and the President, that an invasion was not contemplated, then it would be an entirely different matter. It should be recalled that early Cuban action began during the Eisenhower administration, and that these early projects did not involve an invasion. In fact, all of the Eisenhower-era schemes were extremely modest when it came to actions against Cuban soil and property. Furthermore, President Eisenhower, having been sorely hurt by the U-2 affair and all that it did to his plans for a summit conference and a final peace crusade, had positively directed that overflights and clandestine operations be curtailed. He did not want the next administration to inherit anything in that category from his regime. However, immediately following the election of John F. Kennedy, things began to move, stalled activities began to stir. This all took place very secretly and most certainly without instructions or approval from the President and his Secretary of State, Christian Herter, and Defense Secretary Thomas Gates. It was not unknown to the Secretary of Defense and to his deputy, but the extent of their knowledge may have been unclear, since they had no reason to believe that such things had been rekindled without presidential direction. We shall see later the language of the law involved and the distinction between the terms by direction and with approval. Abracadabra, I create through my speak. That's all this is. Fucking wizards. As a result of these unusual events, was not until the middle of January 1961 that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff heard the first reasonably accurate and complete briefing of what the CIA was contemplating on the shores of Cuba. This was a strange time for such a briefing, because in less than a week the Secretary of Defense would have departed and a new one would have taken office, and in the same week the Eisenhower team would have left. John F. Kennedy would have become president. Therefore, even if the chairman had been seen to... Therefore, even if the chairman had seen fit to carry this information to the Secretary of Defense and to the President, he could scarcely have expected either of them to have been in a position to have done much about it just at that time. This business of the exploitation of the right moment by the secret team is interesting and has been quite apparent in other situations. We have earlier discussed the crucial 90-day period just before and after the assassination of President Kennedy. This was another such time. In the Bay of Pigs project, the Secretary of Defense or his deputy was briefed almost daily. Furthermore, the same briefing that was given to them would usually be given to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or his executive officer. However, these briefings were piecemeal, arising from events day by day and not from a plan, and they were often colored and fragmented by cover story inserts. In retrospect, the view of the Bay of Pigs, which a man like General Lemnitzer or Robert McNamara, footnote, to add to this confusion, Mr. Thomas Gates was Secretary of Defense and Mr. James Douglas his deputy until January 20th, 1961, Kennedy's inauguration, and then Mr. Robert McNamara and Mr. Roswell Gilpatrick followed them. Mr. Douglas told the author on January 19th at 4:30 p.m. that there had been no transition briefings between them. Okay. In retrospect, the view of the Bay of Pigs, which a man like General Lemnitzer or Robert McNamara had was something like what would happen if someone showed a long movie to them, a few frames at a time each day. As a result of this technique, who can blame the busy Secretary of Defense or Chairman if he is not able to piece all of the things together to find the central theme or plot? This may sound unreal, but in the helter-skelter of activity in official Washington, this is exactly what happens, especially with secret operations. When an operation begins as minor action, as did the first steps of the Cuban activity, no one knows what may evolve. At that point, with only tenuous bits of information, it seemed ridiculous to take each item to the President, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense for their edification and approval. Yet because clandestine affairs must be so closely held, and because of the limits of need-to-know restrictions, this is what happened. These busy men received the minor briefings along with the major ones. It became a question of either of them to tell no one. Thus, as each day's moves occurred, the CIA and the focal point offices agreed either to tell no one or to only the top men. This decision did nothing to overcome the fact that these top men were getting the story piecemeal. Later there were some relatively major steps such as planned over-the-beach sorties involving the U.S. Navy in off-planned over-the-beach sorties involving... Oh, damn. I'm fucking up. And we're 108. I'm going to read until the next page and we're going to stop. Later, there were some relatively major steps, such as planned over-the-beach sorties involving U.S. Navy and offshore support of CIA Cuban saboteurs. Only then was the Secretary of Defense told that the CIA was going to put some men into Cuba to blow up a refinery the following night. Such briefings were complete with charts, maps, pictures from U-2s or other such sources. If the Secretary of Defense questioned any part of the plan with respect to approval, the briefer would say, for example, "This is all part of training and aiming authority for Cuban exiles that was approved by the National Security Council 5412/2 Committee on March 17, 1960. The unusual reply at that point from the Secretary would be, "Okay, but be sure Lemnitzer and Burke, Admiral Arleigh Burke, former Chief of Naval Operations, know about it." Then the mission would be ordered into action. By this process, such missions were not so much approved as they were not specifically disapproved. The secret team knew that it could use and depend upon Allen Dulles to gain approval for the big steps along the way by having him get an okay for an overall amorphous project, such as training and arming exile Cubans. Then they could take it from there, bit by bit. From that time on, everything they did in conjunction with the Cubans was to be attributed to that initial blanket approval. Their control over all events by means of secrecy kept anyone else from knowing the whole plan. Most of the time, they did not really have any plans anyhow. Each event was derived from an earlier one or from a new bit of intelligence data input. The Air Force, for example, protested the utilization of active duty personnel on a full-scale basis in Guatemala, but did agree to permit aircraft and crews to fly in and out of Guatemala regularly with supplies and deliver Cubans there. The Air Force was aware of uncertain condition. The Air Force was aware of the uncertain condition of the Yedigoras government, then precariously in power, and did not want to have its personnel sheep-dipped a cover category, which meant that they would be non-attributable to the Air Force and then technically stateless in Guatemala. The Air Force held out for official accreditation of its own men to the U.S. ambassador in Guatemala before it would permit them to remain in the Cuban Guatemalan base. It received a signed agreement from the Department of Defense and of State. Signed an agreement from the Department of State acknowledging the cover status of its men as civilians while on duty in Guatemala. The State Department does not like to do this because it automatically includes that the department in the clandestine game. Wait a minute. Yeah, I got that right. These men then lived at the training base at Rialto and trained Cubans to fly C-46, C-45s, DC-4s, and the combat-ready B-26 medium bomber. There were from 8 to 16 World War II B-26s at Rialto. By Latin American standards, this was equivalent of a major air force. As the Air Force had suspected, there was an attempt to overthrow Yedigoras. At first, the coup group appeared to be victorious. Then the CIA Air Force men realized that if the rebels took over the government, they and everyone else at Rialto would become hostages of the rebel government and might even end up in Cuban prison camps. They were in a desperate position. Their choice was either to fly back to Florida and leave the Cubans or to fight. The Air Force pilots were all combat veterans of the Korean War. They chose to fight. They got target information from loyal Guatemalans who flew with them to Guatemala City, where they bombed and strafed the rebel headquarters, Caught completely by surprise and defenseless against this unexpected force, the rebels surrendered. Troops loyal to Eugenides and others who swung back to him in the face of this great show of power cleaned up the remainder of the opposition, and the rebellion collapsed. Eugenides was back in power, with Yankee help born of desperation. This was the only victory of the invasion task force. Here again, the CIA had gotten in over its head. If that force of Americans, Filipinos, and Cubans who were at Retalihu, along with all of their equipment, had been captured by the rebels, their ransom, like that exacted quietly by the Mexicans of the downed DC-4, would have been stupendous as it was. The United States had to pay heavily for the invasion's failures in other ways. Yeah, we still got like 5-6 pages. We'll pick this up tomorrow. Getting tired.